In December 1610, soldiers broke down the gates of Csejte castle in the Kingdom of Hungary and claimed to find evidence of atrocities beyond imagination. The Countess who lived there was arrested that night, without warning, without charges filed in any court. She was never permitted to speak in her own defense. She was never tried. Within months, she was walled into a tower room with only narrow slots for air and food. She died there, alone in 1614. Her name was Elizabeth Bathory. And for 4 centuries, history has called her the most prolific female serial killer who ever lived. A monster who tortured and murdered hundreds of young women for pleasure and vanity. But the man who ordered her arrest controlled the investigation, silenced the proceedings, and stood to profit directly from her imprisonment. The witnesses who testified against her were held under threat of death before they spoke. The most lurid details of her legend cannot be found in any document from her own lifetime. And the trial that might have tested the evidence was deliberately prevented from happening by the same man who had already decided the verdict. Welcome back to Medusa Awakened, where we unearth the voices they tried to bury. Elizabeth Bathory was not a nobody who could be arrested and buried without consequence. She was one of the most powerful women in Central Europe. Born in 1560 into the Hungarian nobility, she came from a family whose political reach extended across kingdoms and whose name carried weight that very few individuals of that era could claim. She managed vast estates alone while her husband fought wars abroad, running households, administering justice, corresponding in multiple languages, settling disputes among thousands of people under her authority. She was intelligent, educated, and politically connected in ways that made her difficult to ignore and even more difficult to control. She was widowed in 1604 and became, from that point forward, something that powerful men in her world found genuinely threatening: a wealthy woman with no male intermediary, full legal control over her own affairs, and the resources and connections to exercise that control without asking anyone's permission. The rumors about her began intensifying almost immediately after her husband died. The investigation that destroyed her began shortly after. The speed with which powerful men moved against her, once she was finally alone, is a detail that the legend prefers to leave in the background. That sequence is worth holding in your mind. It will not be the last suspicious timing you encounter in this story. The accusations, when they arrived in their full form, were designed to be unanswerable. Witnesses testified that she had tortured and killed young women in the dungeons of her castle, sometimes servants, sometimes girls from noble families, in numbers that varied wildly across different testimonies from a handful to hundreds. The most famous claim, that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, appears in no document produced during the official investigation. It surfaces decades after her death, in accounts written by people with no access to the original proceedings, and it spread because it was spectacular, not because it was supported by evidence. The official record itself, stripped of later embellishments, describes a woman whose accusers were extracted from prison cells, subjected to what historians have characterized as ranging from intense coercion to outright torture, and then produced as witnesses in proceedings that no independent observer was permitted to attend. The testimonies contradicted each other in ways that were never resolved. The physical evidence was never independently examined. There was no cross-examination, no rebuttal, no mechanism by which the accused could challenge what was being said. There was only the verdict, rendered by the man who had ordered the proceedings, against the woman whose estate he had every interest in controlling. The case was not investigated. It was staged. The man who led the investigation was György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, one of the highest officials in the kingdom, and a man whose financial interests in the Bathory estate were extensive and well documented. He was her creditor. He was positioned to influence the disposition of her lands if she were convicted or incapacitated. The King of Hungary, Matthias II, owed substantial debts to the Bathory family, debts that a successful criminal prosecution would complicate significantly by creating competing claims on her estate. Her own children were pressured into agreeing to her imprisonment under conditions that legal historians have described as coercive. The noble families whose daughters she was accused of harming were, in several documented cases, families with existing grievances against her or direct economic interests in the redistribution of her assets. None of this proves that Elizabeth Bathory killed no one. But it does something that is almost as important in a historical case without a functioning trial. It proves that every person in a position to shape the outcome had a specific, quantifiable reason to want her removed from power that had nothing to do with justice for the dead. The power structure around her did not investigate a crime. It engineered a result. If you believe history is written by the powerful, subscribe to Medusa Awakened. Together, we uncover the voices history tried to bury. She was walled into the tower in December 1610 without trial, without formal conviction, without the legal proceedings that even the imperfect courts of her era would have afforded a woman of her rank. Thurzo explicitly prevented the trial from occurring. His stated justification was that a public proceeding involving a Bathory would embarrass the nobility. He did not explain who, precisely, would have been embarrassed by allowing the evidence to be examined in open court. She remained sealed in her rooms for 4 years, receiving food through a narrow slot, writing letters that still survive, and that historians have cited as evidence that she remained coherent, articulate, and consistently convinced of her own innocence. She died in August 1614, requesting a proper accounting of her estate. The legend that formed around her name in the centuries that followed grew with every retelling. The bloodbaths, the Iron Maiden, the supernatural quantities of sadism. Most of these specific details can be traced not to the original investigation, but to later writers who found her useful as a symbol and had no reason to be constrained by accuracy. The legend was not discovered, it was constructed. The historical debate about Elizabeth Bathory is not settled. There are serious historians who believe she was guilty of real crimes, perhaps significant ones, whose full scale may never be known. There are equally serious historians who argue that the case against her was politically engineered from the beginning and that the monster of legend is primarily a construction, built by people with specific interests in constructing it and no accountability for what they invented. What cannot be disputed is this: the trial that might have settled the question was prevented by the man who benefited from preventing it. The witnesses who produced the most damning testimony were compromised before they spoke. And the version of her story that survived 4 centuries was shaped not by evidence, but by the people who controlled the story and had every reason to make her as irredeemably monstrous as possible. Elizabeth Bathory may have been a killer. She may have been a powerful woman who was too wealthy, too independent, and too dangerous to be left alone, and who was destroyed by men who found a pretext that would hold and a legend that would last. 4 centuries of accumulated horror have made it nearly impossible to tell those two stories apart. That is not a coincidence. The people who ensured it would be impossible are the same people who controlled the proceedings, shaped the record, and handed history a monster, when what they may have had on their hands was something more uncomfortable than that, a woman they could not control by any other means. The accusations survived. The truth did not. They called her a monster. History never held a trial. The legend became immortal. The evidence disappeared.